Welcome back. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about seam allowances. Seam allowances are very important, especially when we're sewing without pins. What you may be used to if you are a home sewer and using commercial patterns is a 5/8 inch seam allowance on nearly every seam. And this just isn't as efficient as you might think. Or you may have already figured out that it's inefficient just by the fact that first direction is to, say on a neckline or an enclosed seam, sew this seam at 5/8 inch. The second direction is trim it down to 1/4. So you may have said to yourself, why didn't I sew it at 1/4 in the first place? Well, that's a very good question. And in many cases, it should have been 1/4 of an inch. But let me caution you first, you can change the seam allowance on any commercial pattern, but you must change it on the pattern before you sew it. So in other words, if the pattern was drafted to be sewn at 5/8 inch, it must be sewn at that 5/8 inch because that is the seam line. So you always maintain the seam line. So if I want to change that 5/8 inch seam allowance to 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, I have to trim away 3/8 of an inch from that seam allowance on the tissue pattern. And that might sound like a little bit of work, but trust me, it's going to make such a big difference in the actual construction, the success of your sewing, as well as the time it takes. It's far and away well worth it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's so much easier to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance on something like a neckline. As you can see, a neckline is curved, and if we're going to put a collar on it, we know the collar is cut straight. So we're putting a straight piece against a curved piece. And when we're asked to sew a 5/8 inch seam allowance, as you can see, and probably have already experienced, there's a tremendous amount of rippling. And when you see all that rippling on the neck edge, the first thing you think is you've got to put a lot of pins in there. So you put in a tremendous amount of pins, trying to keep it as smooth as possible. Then the next step is you probably put the collar against the feed dog, and now you sew the neck edge so you can see the neck edge and all those pins, and hoping that you don't get those little tiny pin tucks, which you generally are going to get because there's all that excess fabric there. Then you're going to have to go back and pick those out and try to smooth it out, and inevitably it overworks the neck line and it doesn't come out as nice as we would like it. So here's what you do. You cut that seam allowance down to 1/4 of an inch, and now you can see there's almost no rippling at all. And then the next thing to do is to put that neck edge against the feed dog, because our neck edge is our loosest piece, and it also is bias because it's on a curve. So we always put the bias and the loosest piece against the feed dog, and our collar has already been interfaced, so it's the firmest. I'm going to elaborate on that more as we go along, but I just wanted you to understand that 5/8 inch seam allowance doesn't always work, and you can change it. Next up, we're going to go right straight into cutting. See you there.